Welcome to the beginning of a very serious journey. I've been meaning to start this many times. Now I think that we've gotten to the stage of just jumping in. Many people, including me, have a large interest in studying the discipline of Kabbalah. And as many people as have the interest and a want for that, it's as hard and as difficult and confusing to actually get into it in a serious way, and especially in a sustained intellectual way. The reasons for this difficulty are varied. There are many different confusions. The main difficulty that I've been bumping into, and that people that I know seem to be bumping into, is the way in which Kabbalah generally is taught. If you go to anywhere, almost anywhere, where they teach you Kabbalah, they will generally teach you, number one, in a dogmatic way, meaning to say, not in a way of what we call a nigla'ian. They don't show you where things come from, where do they start, what are the questions, what are the problems, what are the answers, what are the different opinions. You generally get one opinion as if it's halacha l'moshe Sinai, straight from heaven. This is the thing. That's number one. And usually it's not even one opinion. Usually we get one person's interpretation or one teacher's interpretation of what they think is the Arizal or the Chabad or the Breslev or the Hasidus, whichever kind of angle that they have based on Kabbalah or coming out of Kabbalah. That's what they give you. And even if they do teach a text, they more or less read you into the text, whatever they want it to be. And basically we're missing the very basic way of doing intellectual work, which is, as we're used to doing in all other areas of Torah and all other areas of thought, which is just figuring out what the sugya is, what the question is, what the answer is, what are the different opinions, what is it based on, what is the main point, what is the minor points that can be differentiated from the main points, what are things that are just what we call drush, what are just, the Rambam calls it poetry, nice connections, but they're not the actual main point that we're trying to get at. So these are all the difficulties, all the miniyot, all the detours that people get into when they try to get into Kabbalah. And many people have come and told me, look, it's so confusing, everyone has different opinion, everyone says this, so what should I do? So could you give me a class that's just going to give me the basic agreed upon opinions or agreed upon thoughts that Kabbalah is basically can be boiled down to? Now, maybe you could do that, but I don't think that that's the main thing. Mostly because just like if someone comes and asks you to learn, teach me Gemara, right? Teach me Mesach Hilchas Pesach. Okay, so you can get a basic understanding of how to do Pesach. In reality, you go to some halacha class and they tell you, this is what you do, this is what you eat, this is what you don't eat, this is what you clean, and so on. But if you want to have something that can be called learning, and we have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and mitzvah of Talmud Torah has been taught to us, means getting understanding of it. Sometimes understanding at the level of being able to derive yourself from first principles, everything. But depending on what the first principles are, whether you're doing it in purely intellectual, rational way, whether your first principles are, like we learn Nigla usually, the first principles are what it says in the Gemara, what it says in the Rishonim, what it says in the basic sources of the question. At least in that sense, you'll be able to understand things, understand the logic behind them, understand what's going on. That's what's considered Talmud Torah and every other area of Torah. And that doesn't come with any sort of clarity. If someone asks you what's the basic idea of Hilchas Pesach or what's the basic idea of Hilchas Shabbos, you'll get 10,000 different answers. And the answer is you need to learn this. You need to learn the Mesechta. You need to figure out what the main opinions are, what's going on, and then you can maybe make up your own mind or maybe not. But the main thing is there's no shortcut to doing that. And besides for being no shortcut to doing that, we don't really want a shortcut. You don't really want to just give me the final result. This is not about getting the final result. If you're looking for a final result, and maybe, for sure, in Kabbalah or in Pnimius, what we call Pnimius, there's also some sort of final result. If you want something that works for your Avodas HaTfilah, for your Avodas Hashem, maybe you'll need something simple or something It can be immediately useful, but the main thing in learning is not to look for immediate gratification. Immediate gratification is important in some levels, but it's not the way in which Torah works. It's not the way in which intellectual understanding works. You need to put in a lot of hours, a lot of effort, just learning and just dancing between the different sides of a subject. Is it like this? Is it like that? Is this true? Does this even make any sense? So that's what we're trying to do when I want to learn Kabbalah. Is let's try to learn it in a serious way. And learning things in a serious way has a large amount of advantages. The first one being that you can't be made a fool of anymore, right? No, nobody can sell you. One of the first things that you gain out of learning, and even if you learn a little bit, just like if you learn Masechta Gemara, even if you learn just a few pages of Gemara, seriously, now you're vaccinated against being told, the Talmud says such and such. Yes, it says, and then you have to look in Rashi and look in Tosfos, and does it say, and does that how it's understood, and so on. Same thing, Kabbalah has a lot of, I don't know, how would I say, a lot of lies, a lot of nonsense being said in the name, and if you don't know how it actually works, you get taken advantage of. People say, oh, this is according to Kabbalah, Kabbalah says this, Kabbalah says that. I'm sure it says a lot of those things, but if you know how to learn, then you try to understand, okay, is this the main thing? Is this something that some Kabbalah said just as a joke? Did he say this seriously? Is this the main point? Is it not? And so on and so forth. So to be able to know how to learn is probably the most important thing, just like we're teaching yeshiva, that knowing how to learn is in some ways more important than the actual learning. And since you're not just trying to get how to learn, you don't have to get anywhere. We don't have to finish books. We don't have to finish Masechtas. We don't have to finish any content. Of course, you need to know some basics, just like in anything. You need to know the basics of that Masechta. You need to know some basics. So you do some general prefaces, some general basic ideas of the concept, but you don't need to go anywhere. We're not in a rush anywhere. Now, the way to do this, another big question or some sort of confusion that people seem to have for whichever reason when learning Kabbalah, is that they don't even know which book to open, and there's thousands of or hundreds of like preparatory works which tell you, I'm going to give you the basic ideas and I'll tell you how to do it and so on. And all of that mostly serves just to confuse you. What I've received from teachers that I've learned from is one rule: do not read any preparatory works. and of course they're useful and they're helpful and they do a lot to clarify things. For the most part, I would say something the opposite. I would say read the preface after you read the book. And this is true for a lot of books, especially books that have a good preface that sort of summarizes the thinking of the author and his methodology and things like that. Often you start with that and you get stuck and you never get to the actual meat, to the actual part of the book. But especially in things like this, the best way to learn, as I've seen and the way I try to teach, the way I try to learn, is to just jump in the deep end. Just let's get into the actual stuff and see what we can understand and what we can't understand and so on. Now, as far as the textbook for this, so there actually is a textbook of Kabbalah which is literally based on this method, literally based on the method of understanding things, of not just presenting them summaries dogmatically, of showing his work, showing the sources of everything, showing why he got to where he got to. And it was actually used for many generations as the primary textbook of Kabbalah. And that is the book called Pardes Rimonim by the Ramak Rebbe Moshe Cordovero. It's an extremely, both an extremely popular book, popular not in the sense of being popular, but popular in the sense of being important for everyone, even after the Arizal came, which is another whole story we can talk about, and sort of took over the Kabbalah's became a lot more popular. Anyone that still wanted to learn seriously will still use the Ramak's book. And this book has all of these things that we're looking for. It has in it. Number one, and Ramak discusses this if you want to read more about his methodology and how, both why, which is somewhat of a preparatory concept, right? Advertising for Kabbalah and why you should learn it and what you'll get out of it, but also especially how to learn it. you should read his book called Or Nerav, in which he goes through all these things and makes lists, and very organized. He has lists of what you get out of learning Kabbalah and what you're missing if you don't learn it. And one of the things he says many times, and he brings, even for that, he brings sources and quotes, is that Kabbalah must be learned Be'iyun. And Iyun, of course, literally means what we call Iyun, and it has a whole history. The concept word Iyun and the concept of Iyun has a whole history in Jewish learning. But he explicitly argues with people who seem to say, and people say this to this day, that Kabbalah, unlike Halacha, unlike Nigla, does not need Iyun. So Kabbalah is like something people that don't have patience to learn, they don't want to put in the effort that it takes to figure out Halacha. So they say, Allah will learn Kabbalah, and we'll just, since Kabbalah anyways is just presented dogmatically, we just have to believe what it says in the Zohar or what it says in the Arizal, so we don't really have to put in a lot of intellectual effort. And some people say more than that. They would say, since it's not understandable in human reason, maybe it's useless to try to figure out with reason what's going on. And Ramak very explicitly and very clearly denies this. He says it's just the opposite. He says openly, someone who doesn't know how to learn Nigla B'In will never understand Kabbalah either. And of course, might not be enough, but you need that also. You need some kind of understanding, some kind of feeling, some kind of sense for what's going on. So it's not enough to have only purely rational understanding, but we'll get to that soon. But it's definitely important. It's definitely a necessary condition, even if it's not a sufficient condition. And that's also the way he learns it. And if you read his book, so he does all of these things. Number one is he always starts with the earliest sources, or for him, of course, and we'll get to talk about this more in detail, and we get into things. For him, the Zohar is the primary and final source, final authority on any Kabbalah questions. If there's a machlokes, it might even be people earlier than the Zohar. Of course, he assumes the Zohar is from Tanoim, so there might still be some works, even according to him, which are earlier, Safiyat Sira and stuff like that, which we can get into. But he at least assumes the Zohar to be the final authority on every question. So if there's a proof text from the Zohar that shows this, that's how he's going to work, and that's how he works with every question. Quotes the Zohar at length and tries to explain it, and then reconcile it with places where it seems to say differently, and so on. But it's not only based on Zohar. In other words, the very important thing to realize, he is trying to base Kabbalah out of this system of the Zohar, but his questions and his formulation, and we could say his framing, the way he frames different questions, is really the framing that he inherits from the Mekabalim of his day and the earlier, whichever yeshivas or whichever teachers were teaching this, and they sort of framed these questions, and they had these controversies that he talks about. And one of the great things that you get out of reading his book is finding out what actually was bothering. Like there's this title, "What's Bothering Rashi?" What was bothering the Mekabalim? What kind of things were bothering them? What are the big questions that they were working on? What were the debates they were having? Sometimes we get only one side of the debate in his book because he's arguing for one side, but then you could try to search, and some of them exist, some of them might not have been printed yet, and you could see people arguing for the other side, and then we could see later people, the Arizal and others, how they give their input into those controversies. So you get an entirely different picture, entirely different understanding of what the Kabbalah is all about and what's actually going on. So therefore I would have a list of 3 things. If you read Pardes Rimonim and you take it as a textbook, and I want to take it as a textbook, meaning to say I don't want to only teach the Ramak system, which is an important system, and in some sense is not actually complete in Pardes Rimonim. Yes. I think I might have been, the mic went out a minute. So when we learn Pardes, basically, we need to not only get the 3rd thing, which is one of the things you definitely get out of it, which is the Ramak's system, his understanding of what things are, his understanding of how to read things, his basic system of Kabbalah, which is of course something that he does here and something that he might do in more detail in different works. But more importantly, you see how he got to it, and you see we get both the major problems, the major questions that are on the minds of the Mekabalim of his day and earlier, the entire tradition. What's going on? What's on their minds? What are the things that they care about? And you also get a sort of compilation of the most important sources for all these questions. going back to the earliest books of Kabbalah. He quotes many earlier. Nowadays we have many of them printed, and many of them you could find out at greater length if you look up their books. But for many generations, the big source for almost all early Kabbalah, in other words, for at least in the framing that he gives it, and even generally, was in Pardes Rimonim. If you want to learn how Kabbalah got where it is, you need to look in this book, and he gives a great organization of things and many, many, many long quotes, which people get tired of, but that's something that you need to do. So that's all my advertisement and reasons for choosing this book. And as I've said, this is not a choice that I've made. It's been many generations of people that were interested in Kabbalah took this as their primary textbook. And that's also what we will try to do. And we will try to use it as a textbook in the sense of not just getting his opinions, but test checking them. And also sort of broadening a lot when he brings something, try to figure out what is he bringing, who is the source that he's using, what would that person think. In other words, use this sort of as a launching pad for both for the questions that he's worried about and for the sources that he quotes. So we could use it as going backwards in time. So when he quotes something, he quotes a Zohar, we could talk about the Zohar. He quotes some other authorities, we can talk about them and try to look them up and figure it out. And forward in time, so we could see how that is all, which many people assume to sort of supersede the Ramak. That's another whole discussion that we should have in great detail. But that is all definitely is referring to all these same questions, all the same sources, all the same. He sort of assumes that you know the Ramak's discussions, and so on. Further than that is all, everything is based. So this is a very good central point to find where everything is, and to find it in a serious way, to find it in an intellectual way. Okay, so now that I've made my argument for why to learn in this style and why this book, we'll sort of give you my method of teaching and the assumptions that I will make. What are the prerequisites that I'm going to assume? So I'm going to assume that whoever is here, whoever listens, knows how to read Hebrew. That's one assumption. I hope that it's true. If not, then learn how to read Hebrew. And the reason I say this, maybe it's obvious, is because I will not be reading really anything from the text. I know many people give classes on text and they sort of read out the text. Since I assume that everyone knows how to read, and I will make another assumption that you actually will read or have read the sections that we're reading, I will not really read out the text. I find that very tedious and not a way to teach. What I will do instead of that is give a sort of paraphrase, which is a very ancient way of teaching. And I will also, since we have the modern technology, I will post the text on the split screen that I have here. So you could sort of follow along where I am in the book, as if we're having a class and there's an open book and we're talking about this page. The page that fits here is smaller than a regular page, but that gives me a little more focus. Maybe sometimes I'll read some quotes, but I'm not planning to read. I will try to have the text here as copied from Seferia or some other free site. I will add some separation of paragraphs, some headers, so we know where we are, what's going on, that's part of the text. And that's all. That's enough for my preface. And now we'll go on to the author's preface. Hopefully we'll get through it today or maybe the next class. But it's important, and this is another third thing of our method. We're going to try to go through the whole thing from beginning to end, which means literally not reading, but discussing every word, not skipping around saying this is boring. We'll not try to not tell the author how he should have written the text, although there's always, whenever you read a text, you have some comments. You want to tell the author, I think you should have written in this order, I think you should have went like that. We will do that in the paraphrase, try to organize the arguments in the way that makes sense to us, but I'm not going to skip around. So since we don't skip around, we should definitely start with the author's preface to this book. Very important preface, you should read it. It's written beautifully, although some of the rest of the book is written in choppy language. This is really beautifully written, and it gives us a personal account from Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, what brought him to write this book, what brought him to this study of this discipline and all, and what is his methodology, what is organization from the book. And then we'll see in the second part of the preface, he gives some instructions for the reader, and we'll see that points, I'll at least interpret it in the way of reading that I just told you. Okay, so right out he gives his name, Moshe ben Abi Yaakov Cordivero, and he gives himself a title, Hatzoir, the young one. As we'll see in the next line, he's about 20 years old when he writes this. I don't know if he wrote this literally when he was 20 or he was in his 20s, or if he started then and finished. It's probably takes some time to write such a book, but he's literally young. He's in his 20s when he's writing this book, and he introduces himself to us in that way, so we get some sort of picture of what we're dealing with. And the first thing he does is give us his life story, and his life story is a Baal Tshuva story, very important. I think we could probably give much thought to this, but he gives us a sort of Baal Tshuva story. I don't think it's a literal Baal Tshuva story in the sense of I don't know what he did until then, but he does give a story like this, that he saw his youth wither away on chasing all kind of nonsense, all kinds of tavis, and he says, I got to 20 and I started to have yellow hair. That's what it says. Basically, he sees himself getting a beard, and he sees himself being a man, and he sees, well, life isn't about chasing pleasures and whatever he was doing as a child, as a youngster. And he tells himself, what are you waiting for? Why are you drunk? Go start, remind yourself of God, and kum kra lelihecha v'tishka del asaysiv yom yom. It is first mizbech Hashem maharis. I think that this last word is actually important. In other words, he's describing his inspiration, his wake-up call, which he describes as receiving when he was 20, and he literally describes it as a voice. He's heard the calling or the voice of his soul, of his calling, telling him, let's get serious about life. Let's stop wasting our youth. And part of this call, it's both a personal call apparently, to stop whatever he was doing when he was younger, slightly younger, right? And it also seems to refer to a more broader, we could call it national or communal responsibility. It talks about being merapes mizbeach Hashem Hodes, which is language we get from Eliyahu Novi, where he went to the Har Carmel and he found the mizbeach of Hashem, and he rebuilt it. It's in the sense of he healed it, right? It's the word that's used. He healed it, he rebuilt it. In other words, he feels that humanity, or maybe we would say Judaism, but probably humanity is a better word, is sort of sick. Sort of, the Torah is not in the way it's supposed to be. He, of course, has teachers and doesn't see himself as a revolutionary, as making things himself, but he does see the world as broken. He does see the human world, the Jewish world as broken. And he says, start calling out to God. Study Him every day. Be masmid. Go every day, work, wake up and open the book and see what you can do for this. So this seems to be his big calling, and probably important. And I don't at least have more biographical details here. What is this actually referring to and how we would describe it? But it's definitely something important. It's definitely something important to describe. Something important to notice, that this book starts with this kind of call, that his whole life, which became his life project, and he's really gave his life to it, right? And wrote thousands of pages, and he became the teacher of everyone for Kabbalah. And it starts with him having some sort of wake up, some sort of drive, some sort of inspiration. And it probably can really be described as a dramatic move in his life. I don't know what he was before and how, in a sense, it's always hard to find out how literal to take these things. Was he really wasting his time, or does it just mean that he got a stronger inspiration that we can't know? But that's definitely the story that he wants us to tell. Now, what he describes, continuing this, is that having heard this voice, having been inspired, this inspiration, he starts searching. Where is he going to learn? Where is he going to find a place of rest? Where is his soul going to be able to flourish? And he found Ve'eshma kol medaber. So he's heard a voice for himself, and now he's hearing a voice, a public voice, speaking. And he calls him Ir v'kadesh mishma enuches, a malach, an angel, literally. When he's writing this, he's still alive, and he blesses him as one blesses his teacher. And basically he says he found a teacher. And his teacher is Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz, very famous for having written the L'chododi poem that's sung in almost every shul Friday night. but he was also a very great teacher. He was a great mekubal and a great, could say that he dealt with important issues in Jewish thought in a very serious and sustained way. If you read his books, Bris Halevi on Tzias Mitzrayim, he has a book on Shir Hashirim, on Megillas Rus, on Megillas Esther. He wrote very long and elaborate commentaries on these books, and you see him as a very serious thinker and not all of these books are officially Kabbalistically. There's some writings of him in Kabbalah that are still waiting for someone to print them if someone wants to. And it's very important for me to understand the Ramak, which bases a lot of his important ideas on him. So I wish for someone to print it. Some of it has been printed and some of it is still waiting for someone to print it. And he was a teacher. And besides for being a poet, he was a teacher of Kabbalah. And a very good teacher. And if we know it from his student, we can see what kind of teacher he was. He was the one that inspired him to get into this discipline. And he was the one that he sees as his main important teacher, not only in the sense of getting information, but maybe in the more important sense of opening the gates of wisdom, of opening the gates of, as we'll see in the end, the Ramak himself writes that we need, in order to get Kabbalah, like we said, you need to have intellectual talent, you need to have a lot of knowledge, you need to have the right books, you need to have information, you also need some sort of sense of it, some sort of opening in your soul that allows you to do this. And he seemed to have done that for the Ramak, so for that he receives eternal blessing, and for that he has a very important role in the history of Kabbalah, although his books are not very famous, and especially his books in Kabbalah, which still were not printed. So the Ramak is 20 years old, and he gets into Reb Shlomo Alkabotz's yeshiva, where he teaches Kabbalah, and I think he taught not only Kabbalah, but apparently he taught Rebbe Moshe Cordovera and understood that he was a good student for that, and he listen to this, and the Ramak describes how it was it was sweet to him. He found real love with this learning, and he told him, he was motivated him to learn Zohar, and it gave him keys to open the gates of the Zohar. So this seems to be, I don't have more records, maybe there are, but I've not seen, of the Ramak sort of smicha from Shlomo Alkabetz. The Ramak sees Reb Shlomo Alkabetz as an authoritative and also independent source for Kabbalah. So if you read in this book, you'll see for everything he brings sources. Zohar says this, the Sefer Bor says that, the Kuna says this, and so on. And to him, my teacher said, is a source. Sometimes he brings some important idea in the name of his teacher, which don't, at least the interpreters are with them, but they don't have an explicit source anywhere in any written book. And he sees him as an independent source, not someone that's connected to the root of this thing, of this study, and someone that, in that sense, gave him the keys to open the gates of the Zohar. So this is a very important metaphor, very important image, and a very important part of this entire study. I know someone else that speaks explicitly in this language, which is the Baal HaTanya in his letters to the Russian prosecutors. He asked how he learns Kabbalah, and he said that Kabbalah is something that there are books about, but before you read the books, or along with the books, you need to have a living teacher, which will give you some, he calls them keys, I don't remember if that's his language over there, but keys to open the gates. So there's a lot of gates, and we can give you all the gates. We can give you, the Ramak himself calls his book 32 gates. But you need to have certain keys, and all of the texts in the world will not be enough without that sort of living tradition, living inspiration, living transmission of the life of whatever this is. And it's still a good question how we are going to learn. Do we have that or do we not have that? But I'll talk about that a little bit soon. But in any case, he ascribes his teacher to these two things. He gave him the ways, the Arkei HaLimud, so how to read Zohar and how to explain it, and also some keys, which we can interpret also in a more basic sense, certain concepts, certain basic understandings, which, if you know them, you will open the gates of the Zohar. Now, the Ramak describes something like this. He describes his process of getting to writing this book. He says, I started to work on this. Basically, he got this shlichut, right? He got this message from his teacher. This is what he should do, And he said, I'm happy, this mativ manoim, this is what I will do with this kam yomim, basically his life. But maybe he didn't realize. He describes, I will be a son of this wisdom. I will be its son and its lover. And I will go through it until I'm clear in it. So he describes the process of falling in love with the discipline of wisdom, which is beautiful to read. And now he sort of shows us, this is at least how I read it, he runs into a problem. So he wants to fulfill his promise, right? So he sort of promised himself to this knowledge. He promised himself to the love of the wisdom of Kabbalah. That's after being opened, after tasting the taste of it with the help of his teacher, after working on it, learning for some period, he finds himself at the place of, okay, now I have to fulfill my promise. And what his promise is to be the one that actually knows this, right? The one who has clarity in all the aspects and all the areas and all the different parts, all the different disciplines, all the different parts of this knowledge. And he describes how he sort of organized for himself, maybe not only his mind and his writing, all the books of Rashbi. In other words, all the Zohar, the entire Zoharic corpus, which includes Zohar, Tkun Zohar, Mehemna, Medrash Hanelam, all of that, which he all uses more or less interchangeably in his works. And he says, I find myself at some point confused. I'm confused. It seems to overwhelm him, like the image of someone in the ocean with huge waves, and the ocean is useful to him. He's navigating the ocean. He's using it to get somewhere, but it's greater on him. In other words, and again, this is a personal description of something going on in his life. So he's reading and he's finding himself sort of stuck. But it's also a more general description of the state of Kabbalistic knowledge. So what he's describing is the lack of systemization. He's describing the Zohar, especially if you read Zohar. If you read some other works, they are organized with like one or two, not maybe. There's a few earlier books before the Ramak that are trying to give an account of Kabbalah from beginning to end. But the Zohar, which the Ramak and his entire, apparently, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz taught this, and the people, his tradition, take the Zohar to be the most authoritative, the final word on everything Kabbalah. It's a totally not organized work. There's maybe like 5 pieces in the whole Zohar that can be said to describe Kabbalah, the points, the basics of Kabbalah in any organized way. And it's a totally sprawling and associative and I wouldn't say confused, but confusing work. And of course, to the Ramak, the place where we can't say, okay, so this is maybe just Drishim, just Remuzim. We're not going to take it seriously. We're going to take our ideas from somewhere else. This is where we have to take our ideas. And it's written in a confusing fashion. And he sees this as leading to a lot of the confusion, a lot of the mess-ups, a lot of the unclarity that's reigning in the world of Kabbalah. And he takes upon himself, he finds his job to organize this and to sort of give systemization, to give order to this beautifully sprawling corpus. And he sort of does he's going to write something which can be described as an encyclopedia of Kabbalah. And this, by the way, if someone knows something of the history of thought, this is a movement that's happening in general in the Renaissance. He's already at the end of the Renaissance, what we call the Italian Renaissance, but he's close to this. And people that are very much thinking of organizing human knowledge, organizing different disciplines in a very organized fashion, trying to encompass everything that has been said and sort of put them into boxes, putting them into organized ways so we should be able to be learned easily. So he's sort of definitely part of this encyclopedic organization of knowledge sort of movement. And that's why he has the method, and the method is of course writing. So this is also an important thing to notice. So his method of learning is writing. And of course this gets to some level of understanding. Maybe there's some maftechot, some keys that are not being able to be, maybe the Zohar was right for not doing this, maybe, but we can think about that and something you should think about. But he finds the writing of an encyclopedic work as the recipe for the chaos that exists in Kabbalah. He says, I will take my pen, I will sort of organize, I will edit each concept, we call them drishim, but drishim in their language is the word for each subject separately, I'll put Eder Levadai, like Yaakov Avinu did. I will organize it, and therefore I'll be able to sort of divide and conquer, right? I'll be able to know, okay, now I'm studying this part, this inyan, this concept, and I'll be clear about it. I'll move on to the next one, and so on. And he describes how he found this idea correct. So I don't know how literally again to take this, but he sort of describes divine inspiration for seeing that his plan, this whole preface is really he's describing what he does in a very inspired way. So maybe it means literally, but it basically means that it's worked. He sees it working. He sees what we can call seeing that it's Nechonim Mes Hashem, if you don't want to entirely claim prophecy or something, which maybe you should. But just means it's working, right? If someone sometimes has a plan and he starts it and it totally doesn't work, that's not Mes Hashem. If it's working, he sees himself, he's writing one shot, another chapter, and it's working. He's getting places, so it's working. So that's what he does. He opens a book and he writes it. Firstly, it seems like he's describing firstly as if he's writing it for himself. So I'll be able to remember, I'll have clarity. If I'll be confused about something, I'll look it up where he's dealt with this subject. And now it's basically, of course, by the time he's writing this, he's writing in a book for publication. And he calls it Pardes Rimonim. And he gives two reasons why he called his book Pardes Rimonim. One reason, and they sort of connect to each other, but it's interesting. Again, this is one of the only places in this book where he does independent Kabbalah, sort of. And he says it's called Pardes because everyone knows, well known, that this Chachmas HaKabbalah, is known as Pardes. Of course, this is language that we get from Sech Chagiga. Harba Nechnesu LePardes. It's language that should be discussed in its own right. Very important image, very important metaphor. What does it mean to walk into a Pardes, right? Pardes means a garden or somewhere where trees grow or something like that. But that's, in any case, that's how it's been called. Maybe it's paradise, right? Paradise is just the word Pardes, it's from some other language. But that's what it's called, Pardes. So he's writing a book which is the Pardes. So literally he's saying that there is a Pardes of the secrets of the Torah, the secrets of Kabbalah, which are known as Pardes. And this will be the encyclopedia, the definitive work of that. So that's one reason. Secondly, one is it's the Pardes of Kabbalah, and second reason is that it's his own Pardes. And so it says his image is just like someone, as a young person, like he's writing this as in his youth or relatively young, he's in his 20s, maybe 30s, and he says, I want to plant a garden for me to hang out in when I'll get older. So in other words, he's worried. His first reason for writing this book is that he shouldn't forget. It should have his understanding, his wisdom should be organized in his mind. He should not be confused. And for himself, when we'll be older, he'll be mis'adim ba'olam hazeh and ba'olam haba. Even when he'll be dead, he'll still be able to, I don't know if he thinks that he'll have access to his book when he's dead, but to the knowledge that he has in his book, he'll be able to take walks on its paths and enjoy and to play in the garden that he planted. And then he says, why is it a Pardes Rimonim? He says something like this: you have to imagine my book. This is the image that you should have when you read a book like this. You have to imagine my book as a beautifully organized garden. So it has different trees, and on each tree there's different fruits growing. So maybe rows of trees, but different trees, and they're growing. So he says my book is something like that. It has shorim, so gates or larger parts of his book. Those are his trees, and each of them has different rimonim, right? Pomegranates growing on it, which for whichever reason, Pardes Rimonim is of course the language from Shir Hashirim, Shlachayich Pardes Rimonim. So he must have been thinking of that. And not only that, it's like a rimoin. So why is it? How is it? Does explain why is it a rimoin? Because a pomegranate famously has a lot of seeds inside. If you open it up, you find, so in other words, I have a tree, and if you go into more detail, you'll see each tree has a bunch of different beautiful fruits on them. And if you open each fruit, you'll find a whole bunch. And every single chapter has a bunch of chedusha Torah, a bunch of novel thoughts, just like a rimoin has. And that's Pardes Rimonim. Okay? Then he says, I've divided this Megillah, this book, to 32 parts, which he calls Shorim. And why Shorim? Because they are gates to enter into the innermost parts of the Torah and its secrets. So he literally understands his gates as opening. They're not only, so we have to sort of go through them also. Of course, we're going to study them, but you have to also remember to go through them. There are gates to open into the pnimius of the Torah. And then each gate he divides into chapters, just to be able to easily grasp what's going on. So this is his preface, where he gives his own personal reason for getting into this, and where the personal transforms into the public, into the communal, Klal Yisrael, national, cosmic meaning of what is going on here. Now we give some instructions or advice to the reader how to do it. And he says, number one, I'm begging you. He gives a request, similar to the request that Ramban gave in the preface to his work on the Torah. And he says, I beg you that if you do not have the keys that I've spoken about, do not enter, because you will be hurt and not helped. On the other hand, people that do have those keys, he's sure that they'll be able to open with those keys, they'll be able to open his gates, and those gates will open more gates, and so on and so forth. So this is a very important piece, and we should at least keep it in mind. Very important, and I'll talk about it for another minute. It's impossible, and I think personally that this is true not only for Kabbalah, but for almost any discipline in the world, or maybe literally for any discipline. It's impossible for words, especially written words, to convey everything that is in the mind of the author. It's impossible. Even if we're talking about simple literal information, it's impossible. There's always background assumptions. There's always intonation, right? Sometimes we read a text and we're not sure if the person's being ironic or being serious, or is this a joke, or is this supposed to be read with a laugh or with a crying, or what's the intonation that we should be reading it with, right? And even if you do have intonation, you don't know what it actually means. So, number one, it's always, and this is true for every single discipline in the world, when you receive it through text and not through living teaching, not through living communities that are teaching it, you will, again, the way he says it is you will probably be more hurt than helped. Hopefully this is not entirely true. Hopefully there is something to be gained out of reading things, even if you do not have access. And even if you do have access, who knows if your teacher is a good teacher or not? Very hard to decide, very hard to discern. Not easy questions to decide. But we do have to remember this, that what is written is always only part of what is in the mind and in the heart of the teacher. And from this is the other side of this, is that you can never rely enough on the written word to think that you know what's going on. In other words, someone might be very, very booky, very knowledgeable about every single word that it says in a text and totally not know what's going on. And sorry, I was in the middle of a sentence and I paused. We were saying that since there's some keys that need to be handed over from person to person, mouth to mouth, what's called PLP. So even sometimes someone tells you something and it shows you clearly that it says, and sometimes you know what it actually means because you have some prior internal knowledge, some real knowledge, some knowledge in your soul, and you know that's not what it means. And it's not really possible to prove this. You have to have trust. You have to have understand that that's what it is. Now, this is a very basic, a very important rule for everything, especially in Pnimius, and in my opinion, even in Halacha, even in Igla, we should be conscious of this. Now, it's hard to say what our answer for this is, right? If for example, the Rambam said this in the preface to the Moreh Nevuchim, that he's made you swear, as if to swear, the reader, that he shouldn't reveal the secrets. And the Ramban in his Akdama says the same thing, that the Ramak is sort of paraphrasing here, that you should not try to use your mind to figure out what he's saying, because you will not. You need to have some keys that were given over Ba'al Peh to understand what's going on. And this is, even in this book, which is Pardes Rimonim, which is probably the most revealing book of all Kabbalah, right? He doesn't write in code at all. The Ramban, when he writes in his Torah, he clearly writes in code. He's saying he writes Muslim signs. He'll give you riddles. He doesn't say clearly what he says. This book, along with the entire tradition in some sense, of the Ramak, the Zohar, maybe himself, the Arizal, they don't write in code. They write very clearly what they mean, and probably this is one of the big openings, the big revealings of the esoteric hidden knowledge that was sort of given over from person to person. And here he's writing it all down, and it's going to be printed, and he lives in the time of printing. I don't remember if he himself printed it or if it was printed right after, but this was all very much publicized and very clearly. And one would think that so now we don't need to have living traditions. One would think that now everything is revealed, and we see that very clearly in the preface of this book. He says that if you do not have a Messiah, if you do not have a keys that were given to you somewhere else, they're not in this book, right? This is basically saying the keys are not here, they're not written down, then you don't understand anything. So we have to be conscious of this, and we have to notice this. You can't assume that you understand anything. And now, what do we do with this? So, do we have a real living tradition from him, the Ramak, from anyone? Very hard question to answer. I think the more important thing is to be at least conscious of this, that we're trying, in some sense, to reconstruct things, and in some sense, we have to remember that the words that are written down, and even the words that we can explain after understanding, are not enough. Now, I'll say two things in reality about this. Number one is that sometimes one does sort of, after years and years of circling around the point, you get it. This is, in the East they call this enlightenment. And there's some esoteric knowledge, some inner knowledge that you have to get. And not only inner knowledge, even basic knowledge. And sometimes it happens. And some of this is why in the earlier Mekabbalim, so to some extent, of course, you need this. This is what's called the Chacham Emev Meidate, right? We do not give over Master Merkava only to someone who understands by himself. And if he understands by himself, obviously, why are we giving him over? Because we're giving him over certain keys. He understands by himself how to use them, and he has his own inspiration. That's really what he needs to have. So sometimes that's one answer. We learn until we get our own inspiration. And the second answer is that I do recommend, and in other words, I don't want to use these arguments, these points, to discourage learning, discourage text learning, discourage book learning, because they're very important. And they're obviously, in some sense, do include the maftechot. We just have to figure out where. But in some sense, they do. So it's definitely better than nothing, and it definitely gives us a lot of background, a lot of tools, so that when we get that moment of inspiration, that whether we'll get it through another person, whether we'll get it ourselves directly from God, we will know where to put it. We'll have what to do with it. So inspiration or enlightenment without the tools, without what we call kelim, without the background for it, is actually much less helpful. It actually helps to know in an intellectual way, in a sort of external way, all these words, so that when you, so to speak, turn on the light, there will be a room to turn on the light in. That's a metaphor that I use sometimes. Now, and secondly, this is not to discourage learning, but it is to encourage seeking out living teachers, living traditions. Even we don't always know where those teachers themselves got their inspiration. Do they actually have a tradition, like sometimes they say? Are they making up the tradition? But in any case, we're seeing how, and these are things that not really possible to be written down. Often I see people that I've known, even certain teachers that I've known, that are sort of working within a certain tradition, to some extent at least. And people write down what they say, and I was there when they said that, and then I read what it says, and I say, well, if I wouldn't be there, I would never have any idea what he's trying to say here. And sometimes I see people that were not there, either by virtue of just being far away physically or far away culturally, and then they try to reconstruct what he was trying to say, and my God, it's nothing to do with what he was trying to say. So this is a recommendation or an encouragement of actually seeking out some sort of living people, and everyone has that. I mean, even if I'm here, then I'm a certain kind of person that's saying things, and from the intonation and from the tone and from which things are serious and which are not, there's no way out of this, no way out of taking responsibility for that. Okay, so that's one important instruction that I gave to the reader. Now, I give one more important instruction, which is also very important, but this is a more practical, less hard to talk about, right? We could do it. This previous thing that I just said is a challenge, a very serious challenge, and I think I've discussed this at length in other videos, in other kind of Hebrew Sharak Demis class, one of the classes. It's a big quandary what to do. But the second thing that he says there is much more simple. He says something very simple, which sometimes people forget also, but so we'll have to repeat it. which is that you should not expect an author to repeat himself. Which means that the whole point of him organizing this encyclopedia is to have some sort of system where he can, like, in this chapter I've discussed this, and this shot I've discussed this, and this shot I've discussed that, and then since the nature of this discipline and all disciplines really is that they all connect with each other, you sort of need to remember everything at once in order to understand something, and it's very hard. Maybe that itself is some sort of revelation. To have everything in your working memory at once is very hard. But this is why, and after that, you can't expect an author to repeat himself every time and say everything all the time. So he has to cut himself up. He has to say, this is where I've said this, and this was said that. And when he said the second thing, he's going to assume that you've already internalized what he said earlier. And sometimes people read things too fast, or they didn't understand the earlier things, and they're missing some basic information. So therefore he says, please read every chapter until you know it well, and don't move on until you get it, until you internalize it really. Because I will be assuming that you know these earlier things. Now, of course, like he himself says, although there's this structure, if this structure will be 100% correct, you would never have to say, as we will explain later, or you would never have to say, as we've already explained, because we already know this. And he doesn't actually, he's like he says himself, he's not actually fully compliant with this ideal, because in the end of the day, it's still an ideal. And sometimes these are things that we can discuss at length and discussed in Mir Nevuchim. The Rambam Zagdam talks about this. This is a very serious problem, and it goes very deep. We could sort of articulate it better in different ways. Some things, they need they're prerequisites to understanding the second level thing. But on the other hand, you don't understand it until you understand the second level thing. So there's a circle of understanding that's going on. And so when you're in the level 1, you need to know certain things, but you don't really know what they are. Then you're at level 2, you say, this is what I've explained to you at level 1. And then now you understand first level 1, but in order to understand level 2, you need to have already understood level 1. So there's sort of a paradox. When do you ever understand anything? And the answer is that you don't. Or that, again, there's sort of revelation level of things, of having everything in your mind at once. But so in a certain sense, some people say, so you would get stuck. Okay, so he said I shouldn't move on until I know this chapter, but I don't know it. So what am I going to do? I need to know the whole book to really know it. So you learn it once and learn it again and again, and sort of at some point things start to click. But in any case, this is a very important point, not only for this book, but for all books. And especially in this book where he, as we're saying, he's very much, his big chiddush is to articulate the thoughts of Kabbalah in a systematic way. And systematic means that we, in a divisible way, right? You divide it. This is going to be one part, now you understand this part, and the next part, when we'll get to the actual book, you'll see right away in the first chapter how this is like this, how he already is. Sometimes he assumes that you'll know things that he didn't tell you yet, and sometimes it's not possible to tell them, so you have to go back and forth, and that's just how it works. Okay, so that's for that. Now, after here, and this is not the print versions, most of them, at least the one I have, confused it because they put this in the back of the book for some reason. But after this, he went and wrote down the names and I put only the first shot over here, the names and the chapters for each of his 32. So he divided his book into 32 gates, 32 major chapters, and explained each one of them. I will get back to this header that he put when I get to the shot itself, because it's important to see how he encapsulated it into his header. And maybe if someone prints a good edition, they should put this as the header of each. There's another header that he wrote in the book itself, and we should try to see, because it's actually important to have this kind of structure in your mind. And then there's an important thing. Then in the end, when he finishes all 32 gates, and he gives all, as he counted, all 287 chapters, right? He gave it as Pizar, so they're Mefazer Meinasem, they spread their wisdom. That's the amount of chapters that he has. And he says, whoever Vaidev, if you'll know them and be clear in them, you are Oived Hashem B'chalev. That's the person that worships God with intention and with interiority. That's really what B'chalev means. And that's Yesh Mefazev V'noisefayit. So that's another remez that he gives. You're Mefazev, you learn these 287 chapters, and V'noisefayit, and you achieve more moichen, or more clarity, more broadness of understanding in what we're doing in Avodas Hashem. So, of course, if you actually go through the chapters, he only gets to Avodas Hashem in literally the 32nd chapter, which is called Shara Kavana, which is where you're supposed to sort of have all of this in your brain, and then, okay, now I understand what Kavana means. And he gives 3 chapters to define that and more specific and exact and explanations of that. So that's really what all this is for. Now, but that's what it is. Now I'm going to skip this. I said I'm not going to skip anything, but as I said, these things are in the end of the book. I will just talk about these 2 things that he says here very quickly. So he went through, maybe we should go through it, but I can't do it right now. Maybe there'll be another time for that. He went through his 32, so he sort of organized the Zohar's discussions and the Kabbalah's discussions into 32 different sugyas, 32 different things. And we'll get to this in the chapters themselves to see like what he thought were the important subjects. And then he notices that he missed two big subjects that he skipped entirely in his book. And you should know about this and think about it, but I won't get into in detail in it. Number 1 is the concept of Shemitot. So Shemitot was the theory, an early Kabbalistic theory, which said that the fact that this world is created traditionally has 7,000 years. That's only one of 49,000 years. So, in other words, that there's a cycle of the world. And the Ramak, as he says here, was very not happy with this idea, and he claims that the Zohar himself didn't mention it at all, which is something that we should check if that's true. And he says either it's a secret or it touches principles of emunah, of faith, which for some reason, this is a question we should think about separately. And I'm just noting it here. Why the Ramak is not happy with this, we'll get to it. So the Ramak skips it. And second thing is the concept of Gilgul, which again, these are very interesting that he saw these as sort of secondary, or either as secondary to the actual Kabbalah, or as something that, like he says here, they're hidden. He says that Zohar at least didn't talk about it much, about Gilgul. The Rashbi says, talks about Megalet Tefach and Mechasa Arba Ames, so there's like hints about it in the Zohar, but there's not a lot of discussions, so he will skip over it, and there's other places where he obviously does talk about it, but not in this book. But in these 32 subjects, he says he will be noisev and noisense, so give and take, go back and forth based on the Zohar, the Tikkunim, the Re'em Hemna, the Yenuka, Sava, Pekudin, all of these are different parts of the Zohar, and including Sefer Aboy, Sefer Yetzira, and what he calls Shar Mefarshim. So this is very important, his hierarchy of knowledge. You have Sifrei Rashbi, which includes, he counted here 1 Zohar, 2 Tikkunim, 3 Re'em Hemna, 4 Yenuka, which is a part of the Zohar, 5 Sava, 6 Pekudim, which are 6 parts of the Zohar. Modern scholars divide the Zohar even more, but that's at least as many divisions that he had. And then 2 books which are either earlier than the Zohar or unclear, which is Sefer Abur and Sefer Yetzirah. So these are his canonical books for Kabbalah. And then everything else he calls Mefarshim. So as if, although some of them never read Zohar, some of them were at least published before the Zohar was published and so on, but he calls everything else. That's not as if this is the Gemara, this is the Mishnah, and everything else is commentary. Although some of the books that he's going to quote are not commentaries on on any of these books, they're just independent. To him, this is his language, and you'll see it. Darizal also inherits his language from him. He called everything else Mefarshim, because he sees this as what he calls here the prize seed. This is what he planted his garden from, his Pardes Rimonim, and everything else is Mefarshim. Okay, so that's his basic preface. Now ending off, he says 2 more important things that we have to finish with. Well, 3. Oh wow. I'll try to put all of this in here. Give me a minute. Alright, so far this preface has been somewhat even more than we bargained for. You don't expect to learn so much from an author's preface, and here we are. So now, in the next part, we have another very interesting and very important and very rare statement by the author of the book for both sides of what he says. So he's talking about what happens now, since he's writing a book which is sort of an encyclopedia. Of course, that means he doesn't claim authority for himself, but he claims to be summarizing and consolidating and clarifying what the Zohar and mainly the Zohar has said about all these subjects. Now, as he said a minute ago, right? He said that in these 32 gates he'll be discussing and basing himself on the books of Rashbi, and he described himself as planting his garden from his choice fruits of Rashbi's books. So now really he's coming to a question which every person who writes a book, especially if you write a book aiming to consolidate the whole field, you really need to think of what do you propose for someone who disagrees with you. This is something we don't really find in contemporary books so much, or not even in earlier books. Sometimes there's things close to this. So there's really two things you can do. You could write something to the effect of, please take me seriously, or sometimes people write in sharper language, right? If you disagree with me, you're just stupid, you didn't understand, you didn't learn enough. You're arguing with the great authority who is me, or the great authorities who I am myself relying on and synthesizing and so on. Or you could say, which is what I hope most modern people assume, that there's no reason to take me seriously at all. I'm writing a book, I have my proposals. You disagree with me, it's gonna stand or fall on the merits of what I say, and I'm not really making any strong claims at all. And Ramak somehow gets us out of both ends, both extremities of these things. Why? If you come and say, look, I'm the truth, then no truth but me, and what my teacher said is the truth, well, whoever accepts it, accepts it. But the problem is that even the people that do accept it, and this is honestly an issue with many books as I've started in the beginning, they accept it on faith. And that means that do not, most of the time, don't ever get to actually understand, to actually agree with it. Because showing one's work, getting through how we got to where we are, is not only about proving who says that you're right, maybe it's different. It's also about gaining a deeper understanding. It's also about owning the language of the Gemara's. If your Gab Torah becomes your own Torah, it becomes Torah delay. And the only way to do it is by rederiving, so to speak, all the conclusions of the Torah, and not trusting, doing all the work yourself. And of course, the only way to do that is if you read a book who presents his work, who shows his work, who doesn't just tell you to accept it. So that's one end that we don't want to be, and I think that Ramak is trying not to fall into. On the other side, of course, he might claim that for the Zohar itself, but who says that your interpretation of the Zohar is correct? It doesn't change much, even if you have authority that you assume that everyone should accept. And we'll see in Prerequisites in the first shot, if I'm talking about, do you need to accept this or not? But he definitely can't claim that for his own interpretation, which is what he's doing here in his own order and so on. And the other extreme, what's the problem with the other extreme? What's the thing that we lose when we sort of read books only as so to speak on their merits, and we only present our own work on that merit, is that we lose something I in many different classes call emunas chachamim, which means literally faith in scholars, right? Or trust in scholars is probably a better word. In other words, I've seen someone talking about this recently. If you're only going to right away check things, if the first way of reading things is going to be to say, well, is this correct, is this not correct, you're basically never going to learn anything. Because there might be, you never know. I mean, the basic assumption of us learning anything is that we hope and we assume that there might be something that we don't know. There might be something that someone else has spent years and months and received inspiration and worked and gained some knowledge or some clarity or some information that we don't have. And not only we don't have, it's also hard to tell it to us. You know, we need to go through a process of understanding, a process of purification, a process of getting to the mind of the thing, getting to the heart of the thing. And it's work. And the only way you're ever going to do that work is if you start with a certain trust, a certain faith, certain trust in the author that he knows what he's talking about. And this is the pitfall which you fall into when you say, okay, we're not going to accept anything on faith. We're going to check everything. And if you do that in the too vulgar a way, in too direct a way, you lose the ability to learn anything. So there's an elegant dance between having faith in what we read and trying to internalize what the teachers are saying so that it becomes our own understanding. And really, he pleads for this in these two ways. And very clearly he says, please, number one, if you read me, in other words, if you enter my garden, and we read it in this imagery, don't try to rip out all the things, right? Remember, this is the language of Masechet Chagiga about Acher. And we need to somehow taste this language. Acher, when he, Elisha ben Avir, right, when he enters the Pardes, he enters the paradise, or the Pardes of Pnimiyas HaTorah. And he makes some mistake, he does something wrong, goes very wrong in that. And what the Braisa calls it is mekatzetz benetiyas. He cuts the trees, or he cuts the growth that's growing in this paradise. In other words, if you enter a beautiful garden that someone planted and worked on and created some sort of structure and some sort of order on it, and you're only checking everything, and you're only criticizing everything, you're just cutting off someone's beautiful trees that he worked on and planted. So this is the language for someone that goes wrong in his contemplation of these secrets. And it's what he... Ramak, please don't see me as an enemy. I'm not your enemy. And for two reasons. Number one, because all I'm saying is what I found in Zohar. And he says, interestingly, especially in the Shad Erkei HaKinoim, which is an important Shad, which I don't remember which number it is, where he sort of gives us one of the first comprehensive dictionaries of the Zohar, which explains each word in the Torah, which Sfira it's about. And of course there were earlier people that did this work, but not based on the Zohar in his way. We'll get to there and we'll understand better what exactly this means and what it's for, and he has his own explanations of it. But point being, over there he's sort of just most clearly just organized. He said there's nothing added, I just reorganized what the Zohar himself says. But even in the other places where he's more explicitly building his own structures and creating his own edifices of thought based on the Zohar, he said, I don't say anything without at least bring a proof text from the Zohar. And now if you want to disagree, he says, number one, you're not disagreeing with me. You need to figure out what to do with the Zohar. So of course you might be able to disagree, but you have to remember that you have to answer to all the proofs that we brought, right? You can't just disregard you could disregard what I say, but you can't disregard what the Zohar says. But he says clearly, I'm not going to force you to accept my opinion. Adrabah, contrary, we are learning the Zohar together. So I'm giving you the picture, the full picture that I've sort of built out of the Zohar's various texts. And now you want to come learn with me? I have a better pshat. Tell me you're a better pshat. Why not? And obviously the Ramak himself sometimes comes later in his later books, and even in this book, and says, wait, I have a better pshat in the Zohar. So this is actually something that comes out of the way in his method of teaching and his method of learning, that you should be able to go back to the Zohar's text and see, is this what pshat, the correct pshat? Is there a better way to make everything work? But he says, please read it 2 or 3 times. Because I've worked on this. I've put in my work and I've tried my best to make it work. Don't just discard what I'm saying just because, well, you at first glance had a different reading. Read it 3 times. Sometimes you'll see that I've noticed what you noticed, and if you forgot some other aspect of the subject where it proves my point and so on. But of course, and he says clearly, and this is in the 3rd paragraph there, you see him saying clearly, if after you went through this, in other words, you didn't disregard what I'm saying, you took me seriously, you read it once, twice, 3 times, you read the Zohar once, twice, 3 times, maybe you thought by yourself, and you saw that there's another pshat, 100%. I'm waiting for you to tell me you read a pshat. And he says, you know, I'm young, we discussed, he's in his 20s, and you know what, I'm poor, and I'm busy, I have to work, I don't know how the Ramak supported himself, but he's writing that sometimes, you know, I'm busy, I need to work, can't give away all my time for this. And I also don't deny that each person has his own part, his own chelek, v'chachma. I don't deny that you might have your own, like the Gemara says, right? You should not be discouraged from seeing so many people have said so many different good pshatim and different explanations, and say, well, what is left for me to do? Because each person has his own destined part of the Torah. And yes, 100%, if you will come and tell me, I'll be happy. And he says, and if you feel that I've done something wrong, tell me, and I'll crown it on my head. And then I'll listen to you. And of course, in other words, he's sort of asking you to fix him, to make him better his theory if you have a better way. Of course, don't do it just in an enemy. We're not enemies here. Take me seriously. And he knows that he's put in a lot of work here. But he also is extremely open to a new interpretation and to a better interpretation and to a clearer interpretation. I found such statements in the beginning of several different works of Gedolei Yisrael, but it's a rare attitude to have, and it shows the openness, and it shows how when he's writing, he is connected to the source of these teachings. In other words, he's not saying these are the teachings that I have, take them or leave them. He's saying me and you are trying to drink from the well of wisdom. Me and you are trying to make sense of the Zohar, make sense of the Torah, which is flowing through here. And 100%, if you will find a better pshat, I will buy it from you. I would love to hear it. And I'm giving you my part, you will give me your part, and we'll create something amazing out of it. Of course, we remember this statement because close to his time and in his time himself, the big person who actually followed up on this promise, followed up on this request, was Rabbi Yitzchok Luria. And the Yitzchok Luria sort of starts his career arguing with Ramak. If you follow through his first writings and his first ways he's building out his own system, and actually if you follow through the whole system of the Arizal, which of course later became almost superseded the Ramak, but didn't actually, you see him literally taking up the Ramak on this and saying, okay, you're in other words, he didn't close the door for everyone. He didn't say, I'm the last prophet. I'm the Chotam Anvim. I'm the seal of the prophets. He says the opposite. I'm giving you the entire system that we find in Zohar, the entire system in the way that I could understand it. And if you find a better way, if you have a more comprehensive way of understanding everything, tell it to me. And the Arizal takes him up on this and does that. And if you follow through the Arizal, a huge amount of the Arizal's buildings are based through the doors that Ramak opens. And we can show this in some detail, hopefully, when we'll get to specific sugyas and specific questions, both here and both in Kisvei Arizal. And the Arizal, on the other hand, he also explicitly argues with different details that Ramak says. And based on the Ramak's own method of studying Zohar and being medayek every word of the Zohar and so on, you see that Arizal working in the same stream of thought, in the same line, and making things better and adding and enlightening things even more. So that's another very important preface that we have here. So basically, this is the end of the intellectual parts of his preface. Now we find something really important, and it's the Musar part, it's the moral part. Anyone that read any Kabbalah book, if you read Kisvei Arizal, you find Reb Chaim Vital's various prefaces. If you read any other book, the Arnera of the Ramak himself, you'll find a lot about this, and there's a lot of talk about this, of course, and we have to discuss it for 1 minute, both in the way he says it and more generally. There are conditions for entering the Pardes. People might often assume that intellectual disciplines don't have conditions or don't have moral conditions for entering into them. If it's intellectual discipline, then there's just to learn. Of course, there's conditions which are do the work, do the prerequisite work, do the actual work, but all of this work is assumed generally nowadays to be intellectual work, to be mind work. Nobody really assumes it to be religious work, spiritual work, moral work, which are all words for the same things, more or less. And anyone who's opened any work of Kabbalah knows that they all have these kind of conditions in the beginning. Don't read this book unless you're a tzaddik. Don't read this book unless you have good midas. Don't leave this book unless you're some sort of ascetic, unless you have some prishut. You're somehow out of this world. Now, what is going on with this? Of course, anyone that knows something about the history of the disciplines of the mind, even philosophy, knows that this sort of modern assumption that intellectual work doesn't have moral prerequisites is totally not the assumption of every single ancient school of thought. And there's a reason for this. There's obvious reasons for it. Like if someone is full of his own mind, is full of his own interests, his own wants and needs, he will very likely destroy the learning and make it mean what he wants it to mean. In other words, the basic concept of bias, right? And bias is literally, I'm making this very short, all of these things should be elaborated, but I'm trying to just focus on where he gets. Bias is literally the most anti-intellectual midah, the anti-intellectual attribute, the anti-intellectual habit is being biased. And not being biased is basically being a tzaddik. I mean, we often talk about like the ideal of science, the ideal of thinkers to not be biased, to just aim at the truth and nothing else. But how is it possible to aim at the truth if you have bad midas? It's not possible. And it's amazing that we expect it, we almost pretend that it's possible, and it's obviously not. So that's one thing. And Rebbe Salante says literally that thinking without bias is what's called Ispashtis Agashmis. And he's right, I'm 100% right, at least as far as the mind is concerned. Thinking without bias is literal Mesirut Nefesh. It's not something that comes naturally to humans in easy ways. It's something that's rare to find. And people that pretend to be, we can't get into criticizing everything in the world, but it's something that needs to be remembered. That's number one. And of course, every bad, what we call bad midah, every different human mistake, every different human weakness is just another way of entering bias, right? If you're looking for honor, if you're looking for respect, if you're looking for power, if you're looking for money, if you're looking for food, if you're looking for pleasure, if you're looking for acceptance, any of the things that you're looking for might bias you into finding them or finding what you're learning to mean them when they're not meaning them, or they might mean the opposite. So basically, the entire list of bad midot that you find in different works of Musar are just lists of biases, of mental biases. Of course. That's number one. And number two is, of course, in a slightly deeper sense, to touch God's truth requires purification. You can't, this is speaking entirely in a religious sense. You can't enter the king's palace wearing a garbage bag. You just can't. It's not respectful. And by saying it's not respectful, and when we talk about internal things, you mean you're not there. Because the omer kavod. You need to respect. You need to have respect for the words you're saying. You need to have respect for the teaching. You need to have respect for God. And if learning is not just learning about, it's learning the thing. It's learning it. It's speaking godliness. You're going to need to respect that. And if you don't respect that, you're never going to get there. And this is really important. Now, how exactly this respect manifests itself? What exactly it means in real life? It might mean for some people, you're not going to learn Kabbalah without going to the mikveh before. Whether you're going to the mikveh because you need a mikveh or just for purification, extra purification. It might mean that. No, I'm not saying that that's a halacha. I'm not saying it's not a halacha. I mean, even some Kabbalah might tell you that's like a halacha. You must follow this and so on. But I don't know if that's the halacha. But I do know that something of that attitude needs to exist in order for what you're learning to be considered Kabbalah at all. And this is like a literal precondition. And again, it doesn't matter what the actual hanaga, what your actual practice would be. But there needs to be some kind of practice that makes, and this is true for every learning, but especially for learning which is explicitly discussing God's things. You need to have some sort of respect for it. You need to have some sort of level of, I don't read this in the bathroom, right? That's the halacha. That is the halacha. We don't learn Torah in the bathroom. And you could, if it would be just an intellectual discipline, and we can get into discussion on each detail, but there needs to be some sort of respect for things. And I find this important and missing in many different ways, and maybe even here it's missing in some way, but at least I mention it. Now the Ramak here, number 3, third point about this, mentions only one midah. So he starts off saying you can't, right? This is the Holy of Holies. You don't enter it without purifying yourself from the stupidities of time, right? Havlei Azman, the nonsense of time. Yes. But what is the thing that he discusses? The main thing that he discusses, and it is the main thing, is Yinakero Shomei Agava. You need to clean yourself from Gava. Because this is the biggest klippa. This does not let you into God, right? Famously, someone who has Gava, God says, me and you can't live in the same house, right? It's either me or you. Having humility is literally creating space for God. And he speaks about it in this. Of course, if you read Talmud Devorah, you see in a certain sense it's all based on this midat anava. And you should and you should be shemech pasa v'smech be'asira, and you should not be studying Torah in order to become bigger, in order to make yourself bigger for other people. And this is a really dangerous thing. And why is it dangerous? Of course, we know that even in Igla, there's Torah Lishma, there's Torah Shlel Lishma, there's Torah Al Menas, Shekrini Rebbe, I want to study in order to be a big rabbi, in order to be famous. And of course, that sort of ruins the whole Torah, because it makes the Torah subservient to you being famous. So the main point here is being famous and being powerful and not learning and not knowing the truth, which is of course the biggest bias possible and the biggest chutzpah possible, right? You can't take the truth itself and make it subservient or not. Everything else is okay. You want to take something that's some good thing and make it subservient to yourself, okay, but you can't take the truth and do that. But even more, and he quotes a Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah, which talks about this. You can't use Maaseh Bereshis to make yourself bigger. Rabbi Yosef Machanina said, "This kol hamiskabed bekloin chaver elen chelek lalim abo. Bechvoide shel mukeh melachas kama v'kama." This is a very subtle thing, a very important thing between people also, right? Feeling yourself, pushing yourself up on the feet of other people is literally the worst thing. Of course, whenever we talk about humility, we need to give 1,000 different explanations, and 1,000, we don't mean you should be some sort of nothing. But at least for the minimum, you should know that the truth is greater than you. And we barely, halavai, maybe we should merit to touch the truth, to have a moment of truth, to find out what the truth is. If you're going to be going around learning and putting yourself on top of it, and especially when you're learning about the truth or God's truth, which is what Kabbalah is supposed to be. So you're literally making yourself big by putting yourself above God. You're miskabed bekloina shel makam. You're making God less important. You're saying, well, I can talk about God. I can talk about God's stuff. I can be that. So you're making yourself bigger by making God smaller, literally. Like in everything else, it's not literally. It's metaphorically making yourself bigger by making God smaller, because God is everything and everywhere and so on. But if you do that to Kabbalah, you're literally making yourself bigger by making God smaller. And that's horrible. That's Telamna Sifse Sheker. So therefore his main advice, if you want to be worthy of this, is Lisnag b'shif lizman ma. You should, for some period of time, try to not take up space. But that's Lisnag b'shif lizman. Try to feel small in the world. Try to feel small in God's world. Try to feel small among God's people. And you'll see that lets you into the truth. I don't have more to say about this. But if you try it out, you see that it's true. And it's true also in the sense, of course, that, of course, if you go in the so-called real world, you'll find many people creating money and fame and all kind of nonsense in the name of Kabbalah. And amazingly, none of them know anything. So they use Kabbalah as some sort of kardim nachpeba, but it's not Kabbalah, it's whatever it is, it's nothing to do with this learning. And it's actually one of the, I didn't say it earlier, but one of the real things that you gain out of reading books like this is that when you get questions, is that guy that's a makubal because he sees what you did, supposedly, or he could effect miracles, supposedly, or whatever nonsense. is that's Kabbalah. That's not, I don't know, maybe some people could make miracles, maybe they can't, probably not. But that's nothing to do with this. This is learning, and learning requires humility. It requires you literally being nothing before what's going on here. And we could sort of see this, that the people that take seriously any learning, but especially this learning, it goes both ways, right? We say the shiflut brings the Torah, and the Torah brings shiflut. They become extremely, and if you do it in the correct way, and of course you can do it totally opposite way, and that's what we're trying to warn against. You gain such a humility, and this is literally what it means to know the greatness of God and the smallness of man. There's not really a lot of words to describe it. If you know people that have this somewhat, then you know what it is. And it's so different from all kinds of, most of what people complain about, religious authority going wrong and so on, is just cases of people being miskabed b'klei shel makom, making themselves bigger by making God smaller. If you're continually making God bigger, then you automatically become smaller. And if you make yourself smaller, that's a way to see the greatness of God. And the greatness of God means literally science. It means literally, well, the science of Kabbalah, the science of every single level of it. You become really small, and you become really overwhelmed by the greatness of what's going on, of what the world is. It becomes very hard, and it really becomes hard. It's literally, just like we have, and this is at least closer to our experience, this metich shlelishma balishma, right? Sometimes people, and I've known people in different levels of this, they start off learning Kabbalah just because they're curious, or just because maybe they do want to be some kind of Mekibel and gain something out of it. And then the subject matter overpowers them, and you lose ambition. It's dangerous. Don't enter here, because you might lose your ambitions. Or maybe at least your ambitions will totally be transformed to become something else. Because you find out how great the knowledge is, how great the wisdom is, how great the Torah is, how great the truth is. And there's not, I mean, yes, to the extent that you have some sort of vessel, and you could become a vessel for one little part of it, and you want to teach it, and you want to talk about it, and you want to learn more of it, that's what your part of it is. That's your chelik in it. But to the extent that you want to take ownership over it and go around, like you see some people, like, I'm the truth, and if you go away from my teaching, then I'm going to harass you, and I'm going to write letters against you, and so on. That's not how the truth looks. That's miskabed b'klei chavayra. K'pshita, it's b'klei chavayra, and it's b'klei shel makom. Okay, so enough for that rant. Now that's the second thing. Then he finishes off with one more thing, of course, which is literally the practice of this, and we should maybe find some sort of practice which works for this. I will not be able to speak this correctly, but he finishes off like this: if you want to enter this Gana Chachma, and garden of wisdom, you should pray. And prayer is a beautiful thing, because prayer is another thing that's, like the Gemara says, humans don't respect prayer enough. Because it's either like prayer, okay, is a way to get what I want. So, okay, either it works or it doesn't work. We have maybe only if you're tzaddik it works. Maybe it only sometimes works, and so on. Or prayer is just, what other people say, whatever. It's good for, maybe for having some misbundness, for getting some levels of contemplation. Doesn't literally work, or most of the time doesn't literally work. So who knows what we can do with it. But prayer in the most literal sense, and especially prayer for truth, has the most beautiful, powerful thing, that it makes you small. That you literally go, and it both makes you small and both makes you not lose the access, not lose the connection to what you're trying to get at, right? You could be totally saying, well, whatever God does is for the best, then why would you pray? And there were some religions and some disciplines that literally held that. But when you pray, you say, I know that I want this. I know that I need this. I know that the world needs this. And I know that I am not going to be the one to affect it. Or at least I will do my part. Maybe the answer to your prayer is go and do what you need to do. But I will not be the one to affect it. And this kind of vulnerability, right? It's very common, very, very cool to talk about vulnerability these days. But can you be vulnerable enough, the vulnerability that a creature has, because he's not a creator? because a human is not God. That's what we mean when we talk about Yirat Ramimut. When we talk about being a small little creature in the eyes of the infinite. And when you pray, and when we talk about having respect for the knowledge, having respect for the word, having respect for Torah, and you say, Birchas HaTorah, right? And you say, please God, let me know what I need to know. Let me taste the taste of the tree of knowledge, of the tree of life. Let me not make mistakes. Let me not fall into the various pitfalls that are. Let me not take it to myself. It's the most powerful thing a person can do. And Ramak writes his prayer. He starts off with praising God, and in the way of, in Kabbalistic terms. And I've cut it up like this, you could read it. And starts off saying, Creator, Matzil, Boire, Yotzer, Oise. Who can understand one of 10,000 things that you do? Who could think of what you do? So therefore, please, open my eyes. And he reminds himself who he is, right? Let me through my sins, right? Don't let them stop me. I know that I'm not perfect. I'm not a liar. I'm not a aspen. I'm not a mechutzif. I'm not going to say in front of God I'm a tzaddik. I know what I am. And you know what I've done wrong. I don't even know myself. Fix it. And open me to the Torah. And let me not make mistakes. And let me write and teach and learn. And keep. Thank you.